The morgue door slammed shut with a metallic finality that echoed through the basement corridors of St. Vincent's Augustine Medical Center at 11:47 p.m. Dr. Grace Mitchell pressed her palms against the cold steel, her medical coat catching on the door handle as the electronic lock clicked into place, a sound that meant she was trapped with 23 corpses. No cell signal. And the crushing realization that being the only female intern from a working-class background had finally pushed her tormentors too far. What she didn't know yet was that within these refrigerated walls lay evidence of a conspiracy so horrific that her bullies would soon escalate from cruel pranks to murder to keep it hidden. Grace's fingers trembled as she pulled futilely at the door handle. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the autopsy tables and body storage units. She could hear muffled laughter fading down the hallway. Dr. Marcus Chen and his crew of privileged residents, who'd made her 18-month internship a living hell, real funny. "Marcus!" she shouted, pounding on the door. "Let me out, I have rounds at 6 a.m. But the laughter had already disappeared, leaving her alone with the antiseptic smell of death and the soft mechanical whir of the cooling systems. Grace slumped against the door, her breath forming small clouds in the 40-degree air. She'd known this was coming, some elaborate hazing that would finally break her spirit and send her running back to Ohio with her tail between her legs. It had started her first week at St. Augustine, one of the most prestigious private hospitals in Chicago. Grace had earned her spot through merit alone, top 5% of her class at a state school, perfect MCAT scores, and a recommendation letter from the surgeon who'd saved her father's life after a construction accident. But none of that mattered to Marcus Chen, whose father ran the hospital's board of directors, or his pack of legacy admits, who treated the medical program like their personal fraternity. "Watch where you're going, scholarship girl," had been Marcus's first words to her after she'd accidentally bumped into him while reading patient charts. The coffee he'd been carrying had spilled across his designer scrubs, probably worth more than her monthly rentan. From that moment, she'd become their favorite target. They assigned her the worst shifts, the most degrading tasks. While other interns observed surgeries and attended conferences, Grace cleaned bedpans and filed paperwork. Dr. Ryan Torres, Marcus's closest ally, would accidentally delete her name from surgery schedules. Dr. Jake Wilson, the chief resident who should have protected her, instead joined in their games, often making snide comments about how some people just aren't cut out for this level of medicine. Whenever she entered a room, the nursing staff watched it all with sympathetic eyes but sealed lips. Grace understood speaking up meant risking their own careers. The Chen family's influence extended far beyond St. Augustine's walls, reaching into medical boards and healthcare corporations throughout Illinois. She'd tried reporting the harassment once, approaching Dr. Eva Patricia Hawkins, the residency program director. The meeting had lasted exactly 7 minutes. "I understand adjusting to our culture here can be challenging," Dr. Hawkins had said, her manicured nails tapping against her desk. "Perhaps you should focus on fitting in better with your colleagues. Team cohesion is vital in medicine." The message was clear: shut up or ship out. Grace had chosen to endure, telling herself it was temporary. Just get through residency, establish herself somewhere far from Chicago, and prove them all wrong through her work. She'd handled their pranks, the mysteriously deleted patient notes, the surgical tools that went missing right before procedures, the humiliating nicknames whispered just loud enough for her to hear. Charity case, they called her. Diversity hire, as if her 7 years of academic excellence meant nothing compared to their trust funds and family connections. But tonight felt different. Tonight, they'd crossed a line. Grace checked her phone dead. Of course, she'd been pulling a 16-hour shift, and the ancient battery had given up hours ago. The morgue's landline sat on the desk near the autopsy table, but when she lifted the receiver, she heard nothing. They disconnected it. "Think, Grace," she whispered to herself, her voice echoing off the tile walls. "You're a doctor. You solve problems." The ventilation system wheezed overhead, barely functional. Grace had heard maintenance complaining about it for weeks. But fixing the morgue's air circulation wasn't a priority when VIP patients upstairs demanded marble-tiled private suites. She could already feel the air growing thicker, staler. How long before carbon dioxide levels became dangerous? 6 hours? 8? She forced herself to do the math. Anything to keep the panic at bay. The room was roughly 1,200 square feet with 10-foot ceilings. Assuming standard air exchange rates the ventilation was compromised. Cut that in half. Factor in her elevated respiratory rate from stress. A metallic clang interrupted her calculations. Grace froze, every muscle tensing. The sound had come from inside one of the storage units. "Hello?" Her voice cracked. "Is someone there?" Silence. Grace approached the wall of stainless steel doors, each marking a refrigerated chamber containing a body awaiting autopsy or funeral home pickup. The clanging sound had come from Unit 17. She pressed her ear against the cold metal, hearing nothing but her own rapid heartbeat, just settling metal. She told herself, temperature contractions. Normal, but as she turned away, she noticed something that made her blood run even colder than the morgue air. The electronic display on Unit 17 showed 37 degrees Celsius. Body temperature? That's impossible, Grace whispered. The units were programmed to maintain 2 degrees Celsius. A malfunction this severe should have triggered alarms throughout the hospital, unless someone had manually overridden the system. With trembling hands, Grace pulled the lever and slid out the drawer. Instead of a body bag, she found medical equipment IV bags, surgical tools, and several small coolers marked with biohazard symbols, but it was the paperwork tucked between the coolers that made her stomach lurch. Shipping manifests, each one detailing tissue samples being sent to addresses in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and South America. The dollar amounts listed made her eyes water. $50,000 here, $75,000 there, all signed by Dr. Marcus Chen. Oh God, Grace breathed, pieces clicking together in her mind. The late-night emergency surgeries that Marcus always handled privately, the way certain patient files disappeared from the system, the unusual number of young, healthy patients who supposedly died from complications after routine procedures. They weren't just tissue samples. They were organs, hearts, kidneys, liver harvested from patients who'd come to St. Augustine trusting they'd receive the best care money could buy. Grace grabbed the manifests, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold them. She needed evidence, proof, but as she turned to search for more documents, she heard the electronic beep of someone entering the morgue access code. She had seconds. Grace shoved the papers inside her scrub top and slammed the drawer shut, the metal ringing like a dinner bell in the silent room. The door wouldn't budge, of course not. She was still locked in. Footsteps echoed in the hallway beyond. Multiple sets. They were coming back. Grace's mind raced through her options. Hide? Where? The morgue was essentially a large, open rectangle with nowhere to conceal an adult human. The storage units only opened from the outside. The autopsy table offered no cover. The ventilation grate caught her eye, a 2-foot by 3-foot opening near the ceiling. It was her only chance. Grace dragged a rolling cart beneath the grate, then climbed onto the autopsy table. The height still wasn't enough. She grabbed a step stool from the corner, balancing it precariously on the cart. Every second counted. The footsteps were getting closer. The screws on the grate were old, painted over multiple times. Grace used a scalpel from the nearby instrument tray, her fingers cramping as she worked each screw loose. One came free. Then another. The electronic lock beeped. Someone was entering the code. Third screw out. The grate hung by one corner. Grace yanked with all her strength, and it clattered to the floor just as the door began to open. She hauled herself up into the ventilation shaft, her coat catching on the metal edge. The fabric tore with a sound like thunder in her ears. Behind her, she heard Marcus's voice. Where the hell is she? Grace Army crawled through the narrow duct, her elbows and knees scraping against sharp metal seams. The shaft was barely wide enough for her shoulders, and dust filled her lungs with every breath. Behind her, she could hear shouting, furniture being overturned. "Check the units!" Marcus barked. "She has to be here somewhere." "The grate's off." Another voice, Ryan Torres. "She's in the vents." "Then get her out." Marcus's voice had lost its usual controlled arrogance, replaced by something desperate, dangerous. If she saw the shipment, she saw it? Jake Wilson interrupted. "Unit 17's open. The papers are gone." Grace crawled faster, ignoring the pain in her knees, the suffocating closeness of the walls. The duct branched ahead left toward the east wing, right toward the main hospital. She went right, following the faint air current that suggested connection to a larger system. The voices behind her grew muffled but not distant. They were following, though the larger men would have a harder time navigating the tight space. Grace allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. All those jokes about her being too skinny for a real doctor didn't seem so funny now. The shaft angled upward, and Grace had to brace her feet against the sides to keep from sliding backward. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes. The papers crinkled against her chest with every movement, evidence of crimes that went far beyond workplace harassment. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Grace saw light ahead. Another grate. She pressed her face against it, peering into what looked like a supply closet. Dark. Empty. Perfect. The screws on this grate were newer, harder to budge. Grace's fingers bled as she worked them loose. Aware that her pursuers were gaining ground, she could hear them cursing, metal banging as they tried to force their larger frames through passages meant for air, not people. Finally, the grate gave way. Grace tumbled out onto the closet floor, gasping for clean air. She didn't allow herself time to rest. The door was locked from the inside. A small mercy hand opened into a familiar hallway. 3rd floor. East wing. The cardiac unit. Grace's mind raced through her options. Going to hospital security was pointless. They answered to the same administration that had ignored her harassment complaints. The police? Would they believe a disheveled intern over the word of the chief of staff's son? She needed to get the evidence somewhere safe first. Make copies. Create a trail that couldn't be destroyed or discredited. The elevator dinged at the end of the hallway. Grace ducked into a patient room, pressing herself against the wall. Through the crack under the door, she saw shadows pass 3 sets of feet moving quickly. Purposefully, they'd gotten out of the vents faster than she'd expected. Of course, they knew the hospital's layout better than she did. They'd probably taken a more direct route. Grace waited until the footsteps faded, then slipped out of the room. The nursing station was abandoned shift. Change wouldn't happen for another hour. She made her way to the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time up to the 5th floor. The administrative offices were dark, but Grace had a key cardone of the few perks of being assigned so much paperwork. She slipped into the copy room, her hands shaking as she fed the manifests into the scanner. The machine hummed to life, painfully loud in the silent office. 20 pages, 30, each one documenting another life stolen. Another family told their loved one had died from complications. The dollar amounts grew larger as she scanned $100,000 for a heart, $150,000 for a liver from a particularly compatible donor. Grace felt sick. How many families had stood in this very hospital, crying over losses that weren't natural at all? How many had paid premium prices for care at St. Augustine, never knowing they were cattle being evaluated for slaughter? The scanner jammed on page 35. Grace yanked at the paper, tearing it slightly. Behind her, the office door clicked open. Going somewhere. Dr. Mitchell? Marcus Chen stood in the doorway, no longer the polished golden boy who ruled the residency program. His scrubs were dirty from the ventilation shafts, his usually perfect hair disheveled, but it was his eyes that made Grace's blood freeze cold. Calculating. Desperate. Actually, yes, Grace said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. I have copies uploading to 3 different cloud servers right now. Even if you destroy these papers, even if you destroy me, the evidence is already out there. It was a lie. Of course, she'd been focused on making physical copies, hadn't even thought about digital backups. But Marcus didn't know that. His jaw tightened. You have no idea what you're interfering with. This is bigger than some small-town nobody trying to play hero." "You're right," Grace agreed, slowly backing toward the window. "It is bigger, big enough that the FBI will be very interested in why a prestigious hospital has been murdering patients for their organs." "Murder?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "We're saving lives. Do you know how many people die waiting for transplants? We're providing a service by killing innocent people, by maximizing resources." Marcus corrected. "That homeless man who came in last week with pneumonia, his liver saved a CEO in Tokyo. A single mother in Denver got his kidneys. We gave his worthless life," meaning the casual cruelty of his words hit Grace like a physical blow. He was a human being. He was a drain on the system. Marcus snapped. "Just like you, always taking up space meant for people who actually matter." Grace saw Ryan and Jake appear behind Marcus, blocking the doorway. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The torn papers clutched in her sweaty hands. The window behind her looked out onto a 5-story drop, no escape there. "You know what the funny thing is?" Marcus continued, advancing slowly. "We were just going to scare you tonight. Lock you in the morgue. Let you out in the morning with a lesson learned about staying in your lane. But you had to go snooping. Didn't you? Had to prove you're special." "The police will look for me," Grace said. "People will ask questions." "Will they?" Jake smirked. "Overworked intern. No family in the city. History of depression in her medical record. So, yes. We added that months ago. Tragic suicide." "Really?" The pressure finally got to her. Grace's mind raced. They'd been planning this for months, creating a paper trail that would make her death seem inevitable. She thought of all the times she'd been too exhausted to socialize, too beaten down to make friends. Who would question her disappearance? "The maintenance crew will find her in the morning," Ryan added, pulling something from his Paquita syringe filled with clear liquid. "Potassium chloride overdose. Quick, painless, and completely consistent with someone who had access to the med room. They had it all planned out. Every detail, every alibi." Grace realized with crystal clarity that she was going to die in this room unless she did something drastic. "Wet," she said, her voice cracking. "The files, I'll show you where I uploaded them. You can delete them." Marcus held up a hand, stopping Ryan's advance. "Where?" Grace moved to the computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard. She pulled up a browser, typing rapidly. Behind her, the 3 men crowded closer, eager to see what damage she'd done. It was the opening she needed. Grace spun, grabbing the heavy-duty stapler from the desk and swinging it with all her might. It connected with Ryan's temple with a sickening crack, sending him stumbling backward. The syringe flew from his hand, shattering against the wall. Jake lunged for her, but Grace was already moving, adrenaline flooding her system. She kicked the office chair into his path, sending him crashing into the copy machine. Papers exploded everywhere, manifests mixing with regular documents in a chaotic blizzard. Marcus grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You stupid little..." Grace drove her knee up, a self-defense move learned from mandatory hospital training that she'd never thought she'd use. Marcus doubled over, gasping, his grip loosening just enough for her to wrench free. She ran, bursting out of the office and into the hallway. Behind her, she could hear them recovering, shouting. The elevator was too risky. They'd trap her. The stairs were her only option. Grace hit the stairwell door at full speed, taking the steps 3 at a time. Her body moved on pure instinct. Years of grueling shifts and sleep deprivation, having taught her to function through exhaustion and fear. 4th floor, 3rd, 2nd. She could hear them above her, their heavier footfalls echoing in the concrete stairwell. But she was faster, more desperate. The ground floor door appeared like salvation, and Grace burst through it into the main hospital lobby. The night security guard looked up from his desk, startled. "Dr. Mitchell, what?" "Call the police," Grace shouted, not slowing down. "Call them now." But the guard was already reaching for his radio, and Grace heard him say words that chilled her to the bone. "Dr. Chen, I've got her. Main lobby." Of course, Even security was in on it. How deep did this conspiracy go? Grace pivoted, heading for the emergency department. It would be staffed, busy, full of witnesses. They couldn't kill her in front of dozens of people. Could they? The automatic doors whooshed open, revealing controlled chaos. Paramedics wheeled in a car accident. Victim, nurses rushed between curtained areas. Dr. Sarah Kim, one of the few attending physicians who'd ever shown Grace kindness, looked up from a chart. "Grace, what are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be—" "Dr. Kim!" Grace rushed to her, aware that Marcus and his crew would appear any second. "I need help. They're trying to kill me. The organ trafficking one have evidence." "Doctor," Kim's expression shifted from confusion to alarm, but not the kind Grace had hoped for. "Grace, you look exhausted. When's the last time you slept?" "No, you don't understand." Grace pulled out the crumpled papers, shoving them into Dr. Kim's hands. "Look at these. They're killing patients and selling their organs." "Doctor," Kim glanced at the papers, then back at Grace with what looked like pity. "These are standard tissue donation forms." "Grace, all perfectly legal." Grace snatched the papers back, scanning them desperately. Her blood ran cold. These weren't the manifests she'd found. These were different documents, entirely legitimate paperwork that would be found in any hospital. The switch. During the fight in the office, when papers had gone flying everywhere, she'd grabbed the wrong ones. "No," Grace whispered. "No. These aren't the real documents or upstairs. In the copy room, I can show you." But Dr. Kim was already reaching for her pager, and Grace saw Marcus entering the emergency department, now wearing a clean white coat. His expression a mask of professional concern. "There she is," he said, his voice carrying just the right note of relief and worry. "We've been looking everywhere for you." "Grace, your roommate called. She said you haven't been home in 3 days?" Grace didn't have a roommate. She lived alone in a studio apartment she could barely afford. But Dr. Kim didn't know that. No one here knew anything about her personal life because she'd been too isolated, too focused on surviving each day to make real connections. She's been under tremendous stress. Marcus continued, approaching slowly like Grace was a spooked animal. "Failed her boards twice, facing dismissal from the program. We found her in the morgue earlier, talking to the bodies. I think she needs help." "That's not true." Grace backed away. Seeing the trap closing around her, the nurses were watching now, their faces full of sympathy for what they saw as a breakdown. "He locked me in there. They're killing people." "Grace," Dr. Kim said gently, "let us help you. You're not in trouble. We just want to make sure you're okay." Grace saw hospital security entering the ED. Not the elderly night guard, but the younger, stronger ones who worked the evening shift. Marcus must have called them. Everyone was in position for the concerned intervention of a troubled colleague. She had seconds to make a decision. Stay and try to convince people who'd already made up their minds. Or run and regroup. The evidence was still in the copy room if they hadn't already destroyed it. She needed to get back there. Or find the originals. Or, "There's a bomb," Grace said loudly. Clearly, the entire emergency department froze. "There's a bomb in the morgue," she repeated, meeting Dr. Kim's shocked gaze. "That's why I was running. That's why I'm trying to get help. They," she pointed at Marcus, "put it there to destroy evidence of the organ trafficking ring. If you don't evacuate the basement now, people will die." It was a desperate gambit. But it worked. The post-9/11 medical system had extensive protocols for bomb threats. Dr. Kim was already reaching for the emergency alert system, her training overriding her doubts about Grace's mental state. Alarms began blaring throughout the hospital. The automated voice echoed from speakers. "Code Silver. Code Silver. Please evacuate the basement and sub-basement levels immediately." This is not a drill. In the chaos that followed, patients being moved, staff running, security torn between multiple duties, Grace slipped away. She had minutes, maybe less, before they realized there was no bomb and came looking for her again. But as she reached the stairwell, she realized with a sinking heart that she'd made everything worse. Now, she wasn't just a troubled intern having a breakdown, she was a dangerous individual who'd called in a false bomb threat. They'd have every justification to restrain her, medicate her, make her disappear into the psychiatric system where no one would believe a word she said. Grace climbed the stairs on leaden legs, her body finally hitting its limit after hours of adrenaline. The copy room was probably compromised by now. The real evidence destroyed. She had no allies. No proof. Nowhere to run in a hospital where everyone now thought she was having a psychotic break. As she reached the third floor, she heard footsteps above and below. They were closing in, coordinated despite the evacuation chaos. Grace pushed through the fire door into the cardiac unit, her vision blurring with exhaustion and despair. Room 305. The number from the manifest suddenly blazed in her mind. She'd seen it multiple times on the shipping documents. Not a patient. Room those only went up to 250 on this floor. So what was 305? Grace found it at the end of a rarely used hallway door marked Authorized Personnel Only, with a keycard reader that shouldn't have responded to her basic access. But when she swiped her card in desperation, the lock clicked open. The room beyond was cold. Colder than the morgue. Industrial refrigeration units lined the walls, each humming with quiet efficiency, and inside them, visible through glass doors, were organs. Dozens of them, floating in preservation fluid, labeled with prices like items in a grotesque grocery store. This was it. The real evidence. The smoking gun that would prove everything. Grace pulled out her phone, remembering too late that it was dead. But thereya, landline on the desk, probably for coordinating shipments. She grabbed it, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. 911. What's your emergency? I'm at St. Augustine Medical Center. Grace said quickly. Room 305 in the cardiac unit. There's an organ trafficking ring. They're murdering patients. Please send. The line went dead. Grace stared at the receiver, then slowly turned to see Marcus standing in the doorway, holding the cut phone cord. You just don't know when to quit, do you? He stepped into the room, and Grace saw he was no longer alone. Ryan was there, despite the gash on his temple, along with Jake and two security guards she didn't recognize. But there was someone else too, someone who made Grace's last hope die in her chest. Dr. Patricia Hawkins, the residency program director, stepped forward with a sad shake of her head. Oh, Grace, I really wish you hadn't found this room. The scope of it hit Grace all at once. This wasn't just Marcus and his friends running a side business. This went all the way to the top. A systematic operation that had been functioning long before she'd arrived at St. Augustine. How many? Grace asked, her voice barely a whisper. How many people have you killed? We prefer to think of it as maximizing human resources. Doctor, Hawkins replied, adjusting her pearl necklace. The homeless, the addicted, the ones who won't be missed. They finally contribute something valuable to society. And the profits fund research, equipment upgrades, charity programs, the greater good. Dr. Mitchell, you're insane. Grace backed against the refrigeration units, the cold seeping through her torn scrubs. All of you. No? Dr. Hawkins said patiently, as if explaining to a slow student. We're practical. Do you know how many lives one donor can save? 8? Sometimes more. We're simply expediting the process for those who were already circling the drain. Like Mr. Rodriguez last month? Grace felt anger cutting through her fear. 60 years old? And came in for gallbladder surgery? His family still thinks he died from complications. His family received a generous settlement. Marcus interjected, and his organs went to save 3 children in Germany. Fair trade, wouldn't you say? Grace thought of Mr. Siebling's War 100 of the live AT&T Grace. Rodriguez's daughter, how she'd sobbed in the hallway, blaming herself for not insisting on a second opinion. You're monsters. We're doctors. Dr. Hawkins corrected, making the hard choices that others won't. But you, Dr. Mitchell, have created quite a problem for us. The bomb threat was particularly inspired. Half the city's emergency services are on their way here. As if to underscore her point, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Grace felt a flicker of hope. Police, fire department, maybe even FBI, given the nature of the threat. Witnesses, officials who weren't on St. Augustine's payroll. So what now? Grace asked. You can't kill me with cops crawling all over the building. Dr. Hawkins smiled, a cold expression that never reached her eyes. Of course not. That would be suspicious. No. You're going to tragically succumb to the stress of your breakdown. A sedative to calm you down a bit too much. Perhaps, given your exhausted state, by the time the authorities sort out your false bomb threat, you'll be in a coma. Irreversible brain damage. I'm afraid we'll keep you alive just long enough for your family to say goodbye. I don't have family here, Grace said. Then it will be a quiet affair. Dr. Hawkins nodded to the security guards. Hold her. They moved forward, and Grace knew this was her last chance. No more running. No more clever escapes. Just a final desperate act. She spun, grabbing a container of preservation fluid from the nearest refrigeration unit. The lid came off, easily designed for quick access during transplant procedures. The fluid splashed across the floor, sending everyone jumping back from the chemical hazard. But Grace wasn't aiming for them. She doused herself, the cold liquid soaking through her scrubs, her skin, her hair. The sharp chemical smell filled the room. Formaldehyde solution, she said, holding up a lighter she'd palmed from the desk. Standard equipment in a room where people might need to sterilize instruments quickly. One spark and we all go up. Back off. It was a bluff. The solution wasn't flammable enough to create the inferno she implied, but the fear in their eyes told her they didn't know that. Even doctors could be ignorant about chemistry outside their specialization. You're insane, Marcus breathed. Maybe. Grace agreed. Seems to be going around. Now everybody out. Move. They retreated slowly, hands raised, eyes fixed on the lighter in her trembling hand. Grace followed them to the door, then slammed it shut. Engaging the lock, it wouldn't hold them for long, but maybe long enough. The sirens were right outside now. Through the small window, Grace could see emergency vehicles filling the parking lot. Police, fire trucks, ambulances. The bomb threat had done its job, brought an army of witnesses to St. Augustine. She turned back to the refrigerators, looking for something. Anything she could use. Theory: a shipping manifest taped to one unit, detailing a pickup scheduled for 4 a.m. 3 hours from now. Hearts bound for Berlin. Kidneys for São Paulo. Corneas for Mumbai. Grace stuffed the paper into her bra, the only place it might survive what came next. Then she began opening refrigerators, pulling out organs, creating undeniable chaos that would demand investigation. The door shuddered as someone threw their weight against it. The lock was holding, but not for long. Grace could hear Dr. Hawkins's voice, calm and authoritative, spinning some story about a dangerous patient who needed to be subdued for everyone's safety. Time was up. Grace looked at the lighter in her hand, then at the window. Small, reinforced, but maybe breakable with enough force. If she could get the attention of the police outside, if she could make enough noise. The door burst open. Security guards rushed in, tackling Grace before she could react. The lighter flew from her hand, skittering across the floor. Strong hands pinned her arms, her legs. She felt a needle pierce her shoulder. Dr. Hawkins's face swimming into view above her. Such a waste, the older woman said sadly. You could have been one of us. Grace could have been part of something revolutionary. Instead, the sedative hit fast, dragging Grace toward unconsciousness. But as her vision darkened, she saw something that made her smile. Despite everything, the lighter had landed next to a puddle of preservation fluid, and while the liquid itself wasn't flammable, the papers scattered around it: shipping manifests, medical records, evidence of countless crimes certainly were. The flame was small at first, almost invisible. Then it caught an alcohol wipe package, then a box of tissues, then the plastic covering on one of the organ containers. which began to melt and smoke with a toxic smell that would require immediate evacuation. "Fire!" someone shouted. "Real fire!" The last thing Grace saw before the darkness claimed her was chaos, people running, alarms blaring, smoke beginning to fill the room, and through the window, uniformed figures approaching fast, drawn by the smoke, now billowing from room 305. She'd done it, maybe not the way she'd planned, but she'd created a scene too big to cover up, evidence too scattered to completely destroy. The investigation that followed would ask questions that Dr. Hawkins and Marcus Chen couldn't answer with lies about troubled interns and mental breakdowns. As consciousness faded, Grace Mitchell smiled. They'd wanted to lock her in with the dead. Instead, she'd exposed the killers hiding among the living. But whether she'd survive to see justice done, that remained to be seen. The sedative pulled her under, and Grace's world went dark. The sound of sirens and shouting fading into silence. Somewhere in the chaos, evidence burned and secrets spilled out like organs from broken containers, demanding answers that St. Augustine Medical Center could no longer hide. Grace Mitchell awoke to the sound of her own heartbeat on a monitor, steady, strong, alive. Her throat felt raw, her limbs heavy, but the fog of sedation was lifting. She wasn't in a morgue or a psychiatric ward. The room was bright, official, with 2 FBI agents sitting beside her bed. "Welcome back, Dr. Mitchell," the female agent said, her badge identifying her as Special Agent Diana Chen. "You've been unconscious for 36 hours. We've been waiting to hear your story." Grace tried to speak, coughed, accepted a cup of water from the second agent. "The organs, room 305. We found them," Agent Chen assured her. "What was left after the fire. Anyway, but more importantly, we found the shipping manifests you had hidden. The one in your clothing survived the chemical exposure. It gave us enough to get warrants." Relief flooded through Grace, followed immediately by fear. "Where am I? If the hospital staff..." "You're in protective custody at Northwestern Memorial." The male agent, Agent Torres, interrupted. "St. Augustine Medical Center is currently under federal investigation. No one from there can touch you." Grace sank back against the pillows, processing this. "How much do you know?" "Enough to arrest 17 individuals so far," Agent Chen said, pulling out a tablet. "But we need your testimony to connect all the pieces. Are you feeling up to talking?" For the next 3 hours, Grace told them everything, from the first days of harassment to the discovery in the morgue, the chase through the hospital, the final confrontation in room 305. The agents recorded every word, occasionally asking for clarification or showing her photos of evidence recovered from the scene. "The fire you started," Agent Torres said. "It triggered an automatic backup of the hospital's computer systems to off-site servers, systems that Dr. Hawkins and her team didn't have access to. We recovered deleted patient files, altered medical records, financial transactions going back 8 years. 8 years. Grace felt sick thinking about how many victims there had been. "What about Marcus Chen, Dr. Hawkins?" Agent Chen's expression hardened. "Both in custody, along with 15 others." Dr. Chen tried to flee to Vancouver, but Canadian authorities grabbed him at the border. "Dr. Hawkins," she paused. "She maintained the story about you having a breakdown right up until we showed her the evidence. Then she asked for a lawyer. They had everything planned," Grace said quietly. "Made me look crazy. Isolated me from potential allies. If I hadn't found that room..." "But you did?" Agent Torres said firmly. "And your quick thinking with the bomb threat, while illegal, brought law enforcement attention at a crucial moment. The DA has agreed not to pursue charges, given the circumstances." Grace learned the full scope over the following days as she recovered. The organ trafficking ring had operated for nearly a decade, targeting vulnerable patients, homeless individuals, drug addicts, undocumented immigrants, elderly people without close family. They'd perfected a system of falsifying death certificates, bribing coroners, and maintaining a network of international buyers. The money had been staggering, millions of dollars flowing through offshore accounts. funding lavish lifestyles for those involved while maintaining St. Precis. Augustine's reputation as a premier medical facility, Dr. Hawkins had used her position to recruit desperate residents, promising them careers and wealth in exchange for their cooperation and silence. What's disturbing, Agent Chen told Grace during one of their sessions, is how many people knew something was wrong but said nothing. Nurses who noticed unusual patient deaths, maintenance staff who saw suspicious late-night activities, administrators who didn't question, suddenly balanced budgets. Grace thought of all the times she'd been ignored, dismissed, told to fit in better. The culture of silence had protected murderers while crushing anyone who might have spoken up. On the fourth day, she had visitors. Dr. Sarah Kim from the emergency department sat across from her, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry," she said. "When you came to me that night, I should have listened. I should have looked at those papers more carefully. But Marcus was so convincing, and you look so exhausted. And I failed you." Grace wanted to be angry, but she found only exhaustion. The whole system failed. That's how they got away with it for so long. Later, a group of nurses came by, ones who'd watched her harassment in silence. They brought flowers and apologies, stories of their own fears about speaking up. Grace accepted their words with grace she didn't quite feel. Understanding their position even as she wished, just one of them had stood up for her earlier. The trial preparations began 2 weeks later. Grace, still technically a medical resident, found herself at the center of the biggest medical scandal in Illinois history. The media had gotten hold of the story, dubbing it the Morgue conspiracy, and turning Grace into a reluctant hero. "I don't feel like a hero," she told Agent Chen during one of their prep sessions. "I was just trying to survive." "Most heroes are," the agent replied. "You risked everything to expose the truth. That takes incredible courage." The trial itself was a media circus. Grace testified for 3 days, detailing the harassment, the discovery, the chase through the hospital. Marcus Chen sat at the defendant's table, his golden boy image replaced by hollow eyes and an orange jumpsuit. He wouldn't look at her. Dr. Hawkins maintained her composure throughout, occasionally taking notes, as if this were just another medical conference. But when Grace described finding Mr. Rodriguez's name on the shipping manifests, talking about his daughter's grief, even Hawkins looked away. The defense tried to paint Grace as a disgruntled employee, mentally unstable, motivated by jealousy and failure. They brought up her long hours, her isolation, the incident with the bomb threat, but the evidence was overwhelming: financial records, email chains, the preserved organs found in room 305, and testimonies from families who'd lost loved ones under suspicious circumstances. One by one, staff members who'd participated in or ignored the conspiracy took the stand. Some, like Dr. Ryan Torres, tried to minimize their involvement. Others, facing lesser charges in exchange for cooperation, revealed the full horror of the operation. The most damaging testimony came from a nurse named Patricia Wong, who'd been forced to participate after accidentally discovering the scheme. She'd kept detailed records hidden in her home, documenting every suspicious death, every altered file. She'd been too terrified to come forward until Grace's actions broke the conspiracy open. "I watched them target Mr. James Harrison," Patricia testified, her voice shaking. 68 years old, came in for pneumonia. He was recovering well until Dr. Chen ordered a special medication. Within hours, Mr. Harrison was brain dead. His family was told it was a stroke. His heart went to a buyer in Tokyo for $200,000. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Mr. Harrison's daughter sobbing in the gallery. The verdict, when it came 6 weeks later, was decisive. Guilty on all counts for the primary conspirators. Dr. Patricia Hawkins received life without parole for 23 counts of murder. Marcus Chen got 40 years, eligible for parole in 25. The others received sentences ranging from 10 to 30 years. But for Grace, the legal victory felt hollow. She'd saved future victims, but couldn't bring back the dead. The hospital where she'd trained, where she'd dreamed of healing people, had been a slaughterhouse, hiding behind prestige and marble facades. St. Augustine Medical Center closed permanently, its assets liquidated to pay settlements to victims' families. The medical community reeled from the scandal, implementing new oversight measures and whistleblower protections. Grace testified before Congress about the culture of harassment and silence that had enabled the crimes. The system doesn't just fail patients, she told the assembly. It fails the healthcare workers who want to do right. When we create hierarchies based on wealth and connections rather than merit and compassion, we create environments where crimes like this can flourish. 6 months after the trial, Grace stood in a different hospital, in a different city. Seattle's Harborview Medical Center had offered her a position to complete her residency, drawn by her courage and determination, rather than repelled by her notoriety. "You sure you're ready for this?" Dr. Michael Roberts, her new attending, asked on her first day. Grace thought of all she'd been through: the isolation, the terror, the moment she'd thought she would die in room 305. Then she thought of the patients she could help, the lives she could save, the doctor she'd always wanted to be. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it. The work was hard, but it was clean. Her colleagues treated her with respect, even admiration. Some called her the whistleblower, but not with derision. Here, speaking truth to power was valued, not punished. One evening, 18 months after that night in the morgue, Grace received a package. Inside was a photo of a young girl, smiling, holding a diploma. The note read, "Dr. Mitchell, you don't know me, but you saved my life. I was scheduled for emergency surgery at St. Augustine the night you exposed them because of you. I'm alive because of you. I just graduated nursing school. I promise to be the kind of nurse who speaks up, who protects patients, who never stays silent. Thank you for your courage, Maria Santos." Grace kept the photo on her desk, a reminder of why she'd fought so hard. She'd lost her innocence about the medical profession, but not her calling to heal. The system had tried to break her, but she'd broken it instead. As she made her rounds that night, checking on patients who trusted her with their lives, Grace thought about the motto carved above St. Augustine's entrance: "First, Dunu arm." She'd lived it, even when those around her hadn't, and she would continue living it. One patient at a time, one day at a time, in a profession she still believed could be noblious, long as people like her kept fighting for it. The bullies had locked her in with the dead, but she'd emerged with the truth. And sometimes, Grace realized, that's what heroism looked like: not a triumphant moment, but a steady refusal to let darkness win. In room 305 of Harborview Medical Center now, a patient room where lives were saved instead of stolen, Grace Mitchell finished her rounds and prepared for another shift. The ghosts of St. Augustine would always be with her, but so would the knowledge that one person, even a nobody from Ohio, could make a difference. She'd proven that sometimes the smallest voice could speak the loudest truth, and in a world full of Marcus Chens and Patricia Hawkins, that truth was worth every sacrifice she'd made to tell it.